I thought 11 years of marriage had made me fluent in my wife's silences. I knew the difference between the quiet she kept when she was tired and the quiet she kept when she was angry. I knew the way she hummed under her breath when she was genuinely happy and the way she smiled with only her mouth when she was performing happiness for someone else. I thought I knew everything about her. Then I came home early on a Tuesday afternoon and heard her laughing in a way she hadn't laughed with me in years, and I realized I didn't know her at all. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 43 years old, and until 8 months ago, I was a senior architect at a mid-sized firm in Austin, Texas, designing affordable housing projects for families who couldn't afford anything else. It was work I believed in, work that kept me grounded when everything else felt abstract. My wife Claire worked in marketing for a regional healthcare company. We had a 4-bedroom house in the Muller neighborhood, 2 rescue dogs named Biscuit and Juniper, and what I genuinely believed was a marriage built on honesty. The first crack appeared so quietly I almost talked myself out of noticing it. Claire started going to the gym after work on Thursdays. She'd never been a gym person. I mentioned it once, gently, and she looked at me like I'd accused her of something. "Just trying to be healthier," she said, and her voice had a defensive edge that didn't match the casualness she was going for. I let it go. I was in the middle of a complex rezoning fight for a low-income development project downtown, working 70-hour weeks, barely present at dinner. I told myself I was imagining things. Then I noticed she'd started locking her phone. Not just setting a passcode, which she'd always had. She started turning it completely face down on the kitchen counter, keeping it in her cardigan pocket during dinner, taking it with her into the bathroom. Once, I walked into the bedroom and she ended a call so fast the phone nearly slipped out of her hands. "Just a work thing," she said before I even asked. "The project launch is stressing everyone out." I nodded. I went back to my blueprints. But the knot in my stomach tightened a little more with each passing week. The moment of truth came on an ordinary Tuesday. My 2:30 site meeting was canceled due to a permit delay, so I drove home to grab a set of revised plans I'd printed that morning. I didn't call ahead. I had no reason to. It was the middle of a workday. I heard her before I even got through the front door. She was in the kitchen, laughing, and it wasn't the polished, professional laugh she used on client calls. It was loose and unguarded and intimate, the kind of laugh that lives in the chest and doesn't ask permission. I stood in the hallway and listened, my hand still on the door handle. "Stop it," she was saying softly, her voice low and warm. "I can't think straight when you talk like that." A pause. "I know. Me too." Last night was another pause, longer this time. "I know we have to be careful." "I know." I set my keys down on the hallway table without making a sound. She didn't hear me come in. I stood just outside the kitchen doorway, not breathing, listening to my wife speak to someone in a voice I recognized from the early years of our relationship, the voice she used to use only with me. "He doesn't suspect anything," she said quietly. "He's buried in that downtown project. You know how he gets." I backed away. Out the front door. Down the porch steps. I got into my car, and I drove. I don't remember where. I just drove until my hands stopped shaking enough to grip the steering wheel properly. She was talking about me. I was the obstacle she was carefully managing. I was the distraction she was working around. I sat in a parking lot outside a hardware store for an hour and a half, watching people load lumber and caulk into their trucks, living their ordinary lives. Then I drove back to the office and spent the rest of the afternoon staring at floor plans without seeing a single line. I didn't confront her that night. I sat across from her at the dinner table, eating pasta she'd made from scratch, listening to her talk about a campaign pitch she was developing, and I watched her the way you watch a stranger. The ease of her lies was what gutted me most. Not the anger, not the betrayal, not even the hurt, just the ease. She lied the way people breathe, without effort, without awareness, as though the truth were a language she'd simply stopped speaking at home. Over the next 4 days, I stopped reacting and started paying attention. I noticed that the Thursday gym sessions had expanded to include random Tuesday and Wednesday evenings. "Networking dinner," she'd say. "Department happy hour." I noticed she'd started wearing a particular perfume again, one she'd bought on a trip we took to New Orleans 3 years ago and then abandoned in the back of the bathroom cabinet. I noticed the way her phone screen lit up at 10:30 one night while she was in the shower, and I noticed the name displayed was listed only as RW. On the third night, I opened her laptop to check a shared home insurance document and found her email logged in. I told myself I was going to close it. Instead, I sat there for 2 minutes of complete silence in our home office, before I searched the name I'd memorized from her phone screen. Ryan Walsh, my colleague, my firm's lead structural engineer, who had been brought in 4 months ago as a contracted consultant on 3 of our shared projects. A man I'd had lunch with. A man who had sat in my kitchen drinking my coffee and talking about load-bearing calculations while my wife refilled his mug and smiled at something he said. The emails I found were not ambiguous. There was nothing emotional affair only about what I read. They had been together at a hotel downtown 6 times in 4 months. He had written things to her I cannot repeat. She had written things back. I closed the laptop. I went to the kitchen. I drank a glass of water standing at the sink, looking out at the backyard where Biscuit and Juniper were sleeping in the grass. 11 years. A house. 2 dogs. A shared mortgage, shared savings, shared history. All of it sitting on a foundation she had been quietly hollowing out for months. I didn't cry. I didn't break anything. I felt something close down inside me, like a set of heavy doors swinging shut, and I was strangely calm on the other side of them. I made my decision in less than 24 hours. No confrontation. No scene. No giving her the opportunity to spin this, to offer explanations and half-truths and the kind of theatrical remorse that demands forgiveness before it's earned. I had seen the emails. I had heard her voice on that phone call. I knew everything I needed to know. What I refused to do was sit across from her and perform the role of devastated husband while she performed the role of contrite wife, because I already knew how that scene ended, and I wanted no part of it. I spent the next 2 days arranging the practical details with the quiet efficiency of someone who has already grieved and is now simply managing logistics. I called a lawyer, a woman named Patricia Aldridge, who had been recommended to me by a friend years ago in the context of a different crisis. I opened a personal checking account at a bank where Claire and I had no history. I contacted a relocation firm in Nashville, a city where I'd been offered a project consultant role 6 months ago and turned down because Claire hadn't wanted to move. I called them back and asked if the offer still stood. It did. On a Friday evening, while Claire was at what she called a client dinner, I packed what mattered. Clothes. My professional files and portfolio drives. My journals, which I'd kept since college. The framed photo of my parents at their 50th anniversary. Our wedding album, which I left open on the bed to the first page, the one with the photo of us at the altar, both of us young and certain and completely wrong about how things would go. On the kitchen counter, I left my house key. On top of the key, I placed a single index card. I wrote 4 words on it in my clearest handwriting. I read the emails. Then I drove out of Austin in the dark with the windows down and the radio off, and I did not look in the rearview mirror. Nashville greeted me with unseasonable warmth for late November. I checked into a short-term furnished apartment in the East Nashville neighborhood using my new debit card and the name on my lease. I powered off my phone and sat in the quiet of that small apartment, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a new city filtering through the walls, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Relief. Not happiness, not numbness, not the volcanic grief I'd been bracing for. Just a deep, cellular relief. The way a muscle feels after you finally stop tensing it. I turned my phone back on after 36 hours. The volume of notifications was exactly what I had expected. Missed calls from Claire, 19. Text messages, 26. Voicemails, 8. The progression was almost clinical in its predictability. Confusion first. Where are you? Is everything okay? Then fear, Daniel, please just let me know you're safe. Then, anger. This is not how adults handle things. Then the beginning of understanding. I found the index card. Please. We need to talk. I can explain. I read everything once. Then I deleted all of it and blocked her number. I was not being cruel. I was being honest. There was nothing she could explain. There was nothing I needed to hear. The conversation she wanted to have was one where she held the script and I performed my lines, and I was done performing. My first week in Nashville, I focused entirely on work. The project that had brought me here was a mixed-income development in Germantown, a neighborhood that had been gentrifying in ways that were pricing out the families who'd built it. The work was complicated and meaningful, and it consumed me in a way that felt like medicine. I kept my head down and my circle small. The second week, I got a call from Marcus, my closest friend back in Austin, who had heard from Claire. "She's losing it, man," he said carefully. "I'm not calling to take sides. I just want to make sure you're okay." I told him I was. I told him I was in Nashville. I told him nothing else. "She went to your office," he said. "Talked to your supervisor. Said it was a family emergency. Asked if anyone had heard from you." I thanked him for calling. I told him I'd be in touch when I was ready. I did not tell him about Ryan Walsh, because Marcus and Ryan knew each other through the firm's social circles, and I was not yet ready to watch that particular fire burn. The next day, Claire sent an email to an old address she apparently still had, one I only checked occasionally. The subject line read only, "Please." I opened it, expecting manipulation. What I found instead unsteadied me slightly. She wrote that she'd hired someone to find me. She wrote that she hadn't slept properly in 2 weeks. She wrote that she was seeing a therapist and beginning to understand things about herself she hadn't been willing to look at. She did not offer excuses. She did not say it meant nothing, which was what I'd been waiting for, the diminishment that would make me angry enough to feel righteous. She just said she was sorry in a way that sounded less like a strategy and more like someone standing at the edge of what they'd done and finally looking down. I closed the email. I didn't delete it. I wasn't ready to respond, but I also wasn't ready to discard the first honest thing she'd said to me in months. 3 weeks into my Nashville life, I met Renata. She was the project manager on the Germantown development, a sharp, straightforward woman in her mid-40s who communicated exclusively in precise sentences and had no patience for meetings that could have been emails. We butted heads in our first 3 working sessions, both of us too certain about our own approach, and then found a productive equilibrium by the 4th week that surprised us both. "You argue well," she said one evening when we were the last 2 people left in the office. It was not a compliment I had ever received before. "So do you," I said. We went to a nearby bar and talked about the project for 2 hours. Not about my past, not about her past, just about affordable housing and structural trade-offs and zoning law, and the particular frustration of building something good inside a system that keeps trying to make it impossible. I drove home feeling more like myself than I had in a long time. I was not thinking about love. I was not looking for anything. But I noticed that for the entire evening, I had been completely present in a way I hadn't been since before I found those emails. In the 5th week, things escalated on Claire's end in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. She found me. I don't know how. Private investigator, I assumed, given what she'd written in her email. I came home from a site visit one Thursday evening to find her sitting on the front steps of my apartment building. She looked different than I remembered. Thinner. Her hair was different, shorter, as though she'd made some impulsive external change to match the internal upheaval. The confidence she'd always carried like a coat was gone. She looked uncertain in a way I'd never seen, and I would be lying if I said that didn't affect me. I stopped on the sidewalk. We looked at each other. "You shouldn't be here," I said. "I know." She stood. 5 minutes, please." I could have walked past her. Part of me wanted to. But I understood that this confrontation was going to happen eventually, one way or another, and I preferred to have it on my terms, in a controlled setting, rather than be ambushed somewhere more exposed. 5 minutes, I said. "There's a bench around the corner." We sat facing the street. I kept enough space between us to make the distance clear. "What you read," she began. "Don't," I said. "Don't try to reframe it. I know what I read." Her jaw tightened. "I'm not trying to reframe it. I'm trying to." She stopped. Started again. "I ended it. The day you left. I called him and ended it. He's been removed from your firm's projects, which is the least of what he deserves. That's not my concern anymore. Daniel." Her voice cracked on my name. "I know what I did. I know there's no version of this where I'm not the person who destroyed something real. But I need you to hear me say it out loud. I was selfish and I was reckless and I was wrong. Not just wrong like made a mistake. Wrong like I became someone I don't recognize, and I'm trying to understand why, and I'm not asking you to wait for that answer. I'm just asking you not to disappear without knowing that I know exactly what I did." I looked at her for a long moment. This was not the performance I'd been steeling myself against. There were no artful tears, no carefully worded appeals to our history. She looked like someone who had been sitting with something genuinely terrible for 5 weeks and was exhausted by the weight of it. "What do you want from this conversation?" I asked. She exhaled slowly. "Nothing. I don't expect anything. I just needed you to hear me say it." I stood. "I heard you." I looked at her one last time, this woman I had built 11 years of my life around, and felt something settle in my chest that was neither anger nor love but a kind of final clarity. "Don't come here again. The lawyers have my contact information." I walked back to my building without looking back. That night, I called Patricia Aldridge and told her to begin the divorce process. A week later, a physical letter arrived at my apartment. She had gotten my address from the investigator she'd hired. I almost didn't open it. I stood in my kitchen with the envelope in my hand for a long time, thinking about all the versions of what might be inside it. Manipulation, blame shifting, desperate pleas, another performance. I opened it. "Daniel," she wrote, "I've been trying to write this for 3 weeks, and every version sounded like something I was writing for you to read rather than something true. So I'm going to try to be true, even if it lands wrong. There's no excuse for what I did. Not the hours you worked, not the distance I felt, not the attention I thought I was missing. None of that was a reason. Those were explanations I was building in my own head to make something inexcusable feel less inexcusable, and I'm done building them. What I did with Ryan was real, and it was physical, and I let it go on for 4 months while lying to your face every day. I let you have lunch with him. I let him sit in our kitchen. I did that. I have to live with that. My therapist keeps asking me why I didn't just say something was wrong, why I didn't come to you first. I've been thinking about that question for weeks, and I think the honest answer is that saying something was wrong would have required me to look directly at what I was afraid of, and I wasn't brave enough to do that. Instead, I found something that let me avoid looking. That's not your failure. That's mine. I've signed whatever Patricia has sent me. I haven't contested anything. The house is yours to sell or keep. I've moved into an apartment. I took nothing from our joint accounts that wasn't my half. I'm not writing this to ask for anything. I know I don't have that right. I'm writing it because I spent 11 years with a man who was genuinely good, and he deserved better than what I gave him at the end, and I needed him to know that I know that. I hope Nashville is good to you. I mean that without conditions. Claire. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope and placed it in the drawer of my bedside table, not because I planned to read it again, but because throwing it away felt like lying to myself about what had happened between us. It had happened. She had written something honest. Both things were true at the same time, and I was learning to hold contradictions without needing to resolve them. I emailed Patricia and told her to finalize the settlement Claire had proposed. I asked her to make it clean and quiet and fast. 3 months into my Nashville life, the Germantown project hit a particularly brutal stretch. A zoning variance we needed was held up by a city council member who had been systematically blocking affordable housing development for 4 years, and the delay threatened to put 3 families back on a waiting list they'd been on for 18 months. Renata and I spent 2 weeks working late every night, building the case we'd need to make to the council subcommittee. We argued constantly and productively. She pushed back on my structural assumptions with data I hadn't considered. I pushed back on her timeline projections with construction realities she'd underestimated. Somewhere in the grinding work of trying to build something good against significant resistance, we became something I couldn't immediately categorize. One Friday night, long after the rest of the team had gone home, she leaned back in her chair and looked at me across the table covered in site plans and said, "You never talk about why you left Austin." "No," I agreed. "I don't." She nodded slowly. "Okay." She gathered her things. Same time Monday. She didn't pry. She didn't perform concern. She just accepted the boundary the way she accepted everything, with the kind of equanimity that came from someone who had done their own difficult work and knew you couldn't rush another person's. I walked out to the parking lot with her. The night was mild, Nashville spring arriving early, the air carrying that particular quality of possibility that you only notice when your life is genuinely changing. "I got divorced," I said, before I'd fully decided to say it. She looked at me. "Finalized 3 weeks ago," I said. "I moved here because I needed to be somewhere that wasn't there." "That makes sense," she said simply. No performance of sympathy, no rush to fill the space with comfort. We stood in the parking lot for another few minutes, not talking about anything heavy, just talking about a restaurant she'd found near the river that she thought I'd like. Then we said goodnight and got in our separate cars. Driving home, I realized I felt completely unafraid. Not of her, not of the conversation we'd just had, not of whatever might come next. Just clear, the way a window is clear after rain. 6 months after I'd driven out of Austin in the dark, I stood on the front porch of a small craftsman house I'd rented in the Five Points neighborhood, watching the evening settle over the street. The house was nothing like the sleek modern place Claire and I had shared. It was smaller, older, slightly impractical in its layout, and more fully mine than any space I'd occupied since before I was married. I'd furnished it slowly and deliberately, choosing things for reasons of my own, instead of performing the tastes of a partnership. Biscuit and Juniper were with me. I'd driven back to Austin 2 months after leaving to collect them, a conversation with Claire that lasted 4 minutes and took place on the front porch of our old house, which had sold faster than either of our lawyers had expected. She looked better than she had in Nashville. Not happy, but stable. We spoke like people who had once been close and were now relearning how to be strangers, which was exactly what we were. I took the dogs and drove back to Nashville and didn't look in the rearview mirror that time either. The Germantown project was approved. All 3 families moved in on a Wednesday morning in April. Renata and I stood across the street and watched them carry boxes through the front doors, kids running up unfamiliar staircases, someone's grandmother sitting in a folding chair on a new front porch, and neither of us said anything for a long time because there was nothing to say that the moment wasn't already saying. "Good work," she said finally. "You too," I said. She looked at me sideways. "There's a decent jazz bar 3 blocks from here. If you're not doing anything." I looked back at the building we'd fought to get built, at the families settling into rooms that were now their rooms, at the concrete and steel and glass that had been, 8 months ago, nothing but a set of contested proposals in a binder on my desk. "I'm not doing anything," I said. We walked the 3 blocks without talking much, just existing next to each other in the comfortable silence of people who had been through something difficult together and were now on the other side of it. The evening was warm and the bar was lit with the kind of low gold light that makes everything look like it's worth staying for. Over the following weeks, Renata and I moved slowly and without urgency towards something neither of us rushed to define. There was no performance of romance, no grand gestures, no attempt to recreate what either of us had lost. We were 2 people who liked each other's minds and trusted each other's honesty and were willing to find out what that added up to without forcing it. One evening in May, we sat on my porch with coffee after dinner, watching the neighborhood slow down into night. Biscuit was asleep at our feet. Juniper had found a patch of porch rail to lean against and was conducting some private survey of the yard. "You seem like you're actually here," Renata said. "Like, present, not somewhere else." I thought about the man who had driven out of Austin in November with his hands shaking and his whole life in a few duffel bags in the back seat. I thought about the parking lot where I'd sat for an hour and a half watching strangers load lumber. I thought about the letter in the drawer of my bedside table and the 4 words on an index card on a kitchen counter in a house that no longer existed as I'd known it. "I am here," I said. She nodded. "That's harder than it sounds." "It is," I agreed. We sat in the quiet for a while longer, the comfortable kind, the kind you can only share with someone you don't have to perform for. The kind built on something that actually holds. I had spent 11 years in a marriage I thought was real, and the hardest lesson of walking away from it was not what I'd lost but what I'd been willing to settle for without admitting I was settling. I had called it a good life because it looked like a good life from the outside, and I had confused that with actually living one. Leaving without a word had been the one honest thing I'd done in the last year of that marriage. No ultimatums, no tearful accusations, no giving her the opportunity to reframe what I already knew. Just my key on the counter, 4 words on an index card, and the door closing behind me. My silence had said everything that needed saying. And in that silence, I had finally found a way to begin again.